Consciousness is so obvious that for many people, they don't even know what you're talking about. Most academics, and this is now true everywhere in the world, are taught according to principles that have developed within Western science. That scientific worldview is based on a philosophical set of assumptions known as materialism. So materialism, in a nutshell, means that everything is made out of matter and energy, including mind, including consciousness, including everything we know about subjectivity. That's the prevailing view. So if you're challenging that view, you have the same problem that you would in any domain where you start challenging the status quo. The status quo doesn't like to be challenged, so it will push hard against anything that challenges it and attempt to squash it. This is the problem of materialism. Materialism doesn't know what to do with consciousness, so it sort of sets it aside. We'll worry about that later. Or it comes up with the idea that somehow the brain is complex enough that it gives rise to experience, even though nobody has any idea how that could possibly be. And we know that materialism is pretty good because it gives us the technology to do this sort of an interview with a special machine that captures my image and so on. So we don't want to throw materialism away. It's too good. The question is it good enough to account for everything? And here's where we have the problem.
René Descartes, the father of Western philosophy, is famous for the saying, "I think, therefore I am." No other phrase more clearly encapsulates the fall of civilization and the full-scale identification with the shadows on the cave wall. Descartes' error, like the error of almost all humans, was the equating of fundamental being with thinking. Ironically, the demon Descartes envisioned was the very thing that he defined himself by. When you realize Samadhi, it becomes clear that there is a controller. There is a machine, an evil demon leeching your life day after day. The machine is you. The problem is that we do not understand the tool that we are using. We do not understand the human mind and its proper role and purpose. Our rationalism has robbed us of our ability to recognize and experience the wisdom of many ancient cultures. Our egoic thinking has robbed us of the ability to feel the depth and profound sacredness of life, the numinosity of life, and to realize entirely different levels of consciousness, which are now almost lost to humanity. In the ancient Egyptian tradition, netters were archetypal forms whose characteristics could be embodied by those who purified their physical and spiritual bodies in such a way that they were fit to house higher consciousnesses. The original netter, or the divine principle of this wisdom, was known as Thoth, or Tehuti, often depicted as a scribe with the head of a bird or ibis, and represented the origin of all knowledge and wisdom. Thoth could be described as the cosmic principle of thinking, or thought. Thoth gave us language, concepts, writing, mathematics, and all the arts and manifestations of the mind. Only those who had gone through special training were allowed to access Thoth's sacred knowledge. The Book of Thoth is not a physical book, but is the wisdom of the Akashic or etheric realm. Legend tells that Thoth's knowledge was deeply hidden in a secret place within every human being, and was protected by a golden serpent. The archetypal or perennial myth of the serpent or dragon guarding a treasure is one that permeates many cultures and has been called by names such as Kundalini Shakti, Chi, Holy Spirit, and inner energy. The golden serpent is the egoic construct, which is bound in the inner energies, and until it's mastered and overcome, the soul will never be able to attain the true wisdom. It was said that the Book of Thoth brought nothing but suffering to any individual who read it, even though they would find the secrets of the gods themselves and all that is hidden within the stars. What must be understood is that the book brought suffering to any individual who read it, any ego that tried to control it. In the Egyptian tradition, awakened consciousness was represented by Osiris. Without this awakened consciousness, any knowledge or understanding attained by the limited self would be dangerous, disconnected from higher wisdom. The eye of Horus had to be open. The esoteric meaning that we find here is similar to the more familiar story of the fall in the Garden of Eden. The Book of Thoth parallels the tree of knowledge of good and evil, whose fruit Adam and Eve were tempted to eat. Humanity, of course, has already eaten the forbidden fruit, already opened the Book of Thoth, and has been cast out of the garden.
Mystics called Kundalini by another name, Holy Spirit. In John 3:12, it says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Jesus and Moses awakened their Kundalini energy, bringing awakened consciousness to the unconscious reptilian forces that drive human craving. Jesus was said to have spent 40 days and nights in the desert, during which time he was tempted by Satan. Similarly, the Buddha was tempted by Mara as he sat to reach enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, or wisdom tree. Both Christ and Buddha had to turn away from the lure of sensory pleasures and worldly grasping. In each story, the demon is the personification of one's own attachments.
The serpent is a metaphor for the primordial spiral that extends from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Today, the serpent is living as you. It is the egoic mind expressed as the manifested world. We have never before had access to so much knowledge. We've gone deep into the material world, even finding the so-called God particle. But we've never been more limited, more ignorant of who we are and how to live. And we do not understand the mechanism by which we create suffering.
G often returned afterwards to this example of prison and escape from prison in his talks. Sometimes he began with it, and then his favourite statement was that if a man in prison was at any time to have a chance of escape, then he must first of all realise that he is in prison. So long as he fails to realise this, so long as he thinks he is free, he has no chance whatsoever. No one can help or liberate him by force, against his will, in opposition to his wishes. If liberation is possible, It is possible only as a result of great labour and great efforts, and, above all, of conscious efforts towards a definite aim.
The mind can be likened to a trap for consciousness, a labyrinth or a prison. It is not that you are in prison, you are the prison. The prison is an illusion. If you are identified with an illusory self, then you are asleep. Once you are aware of the prison, if you fight to get out of the illusion, then you're treating the illusion as if it's real, and you still remain asleep. Except now the dream becomes a nightmare. You'll be chasing and running from shadows forever. Samadhi is awakening from the dream of the separate self, or the egoic construct. Samadhi is awakening from identification with the prison that I call me.
I see it as you go along in your daily life, you are a certain way, and then one day you wake up. And from that moment, everything before that seems like a dream. And you can wake up multiple times. So in my life, I remember 2 instances where just walking to class in college one day in the morning, I woke up. I mean, it was a very strange experience, a little bit like you're sleeping, and now you wake up and you become aware. There was a step function while walking to class one morning that everything before that I felt as though I was sleeping, and that this has happened twice. So I'm imagining that there are many things that can push that kind of experience. The more awake you are, and the less dreaming you are, I think the closer to enlightenment you get.
You can never actually be free, because wherever you go, your prison is there. Awakening is not about getting rid of the mind or the matrix. On the contrary, when you're not identified with it, then you can experience the play of life more fully, enjoying the show as it is, without craving or fear. In the ancient teachings, this was called the divine game of Leela, the game of playing in duality.
What particularly influenced me was that one day while I was at the University of Virginia teaching and doing some research, I was reading Ouspensky's book, and he was describing Gurdjieff's method of becoming more awake or aware. Of waking up was the attitude he used. Yep. And the essence of the method is that ordinarily our attention gets totally absorbed in whatever we're perceiving. So if I was listening to you or talking to you, I'd be all absorbed in what you're saying and so forth. But Gurdjieff said you have to split your attention, so you're also paying attention backwards to how you're reacting and what you're doing, as well as what you're taking in from the outside. So I was trying to do that while reading it, and for a few seconds it worked. And this was 50 years ago, and I couldn't really describe at the time what happened, so it's even harder now. But I have to say that, at least in a relative sense, I woke up. For a few seconds, I was in a state of consciousness where somehow it was perfectly clear that my ordinary consciousness was just a dull bunch of conditioned responses. Even though by ordinary standards I was a smart intellectual and practical person and all that sort of thing, but I wasn't awake. And then I went back to my usual sleep and could think about it intellectually and talk about it and whatnot, but it was years before I could actually have that even moment of waking experience again.
So it lasted just a few seconds, and it had a profound impact on you.
It was so obviously different. And I thought of myself as having a pretty stubborn mind. It didn't change easily.
Yeah.
But Gurdjieff's primary teaching that he approached people with is man is asleep. Now, of course, we'd want to make it politically correct today and say humans are asleep and all that.
Yeah.
And what he really meant by that, to put it in better language, is not that we're asleep in the sense that we're not at all responsive, but that we're living in an internal daydream. And that daydream is distorting our perceptions of everything, our reactions, and the way we then act back. So we're sleepwalking through life.
Human consciousness is a continuum. On one extreme, humans are identified with the material self. On the other extreme is Samadhi, the cessation of self. Every step we take on the continuum towards Samadhi brings less suffering. Less suffering does not mean life is free from pain. Samadhi is beyond the duality of pain and pleasure. What it means is that there is less mind, less self creating resistance to whatever unfolds.
And that resistance is what creates suffering.
Kundalini is not energy that can be forced by will, effort, and friction. It is analogous to growing a flower. All we can do as good gardeners is prepare the soil in proper conditions and let nature take its course. If you force a flower to open prematurely, you will destroy it. It grows with its own intelligence, with its own self-organizing direction. The egoic mind, which fixates on the outer world, is what keeps you from experiencing your true inner vibratory nature. When consciousness is turned within, it becomes like the sun's rays, and the lotus within begins to grow.
Sight beyond sight.
Imagine for a moment that you were just born again, or that all your memory has been put on hold and you're seeing the world free and clear of cultural conditioning. Imagine all the explanations for what this world is and why it is the way it appears have been erased. Imagine you take a look at the people in your neighborhood, the animals in homes and in nature, the health of the oceans, forests, and communities. What questions would you begin formulating, and what role do you play in all of this?
And that is this, that before we decide either to save the planet or to destroy it, we pause for a moment of silence. I don't mean that kind of grim silence which one observes when somebody says, such and such a famous person has just died, and we'll observe a moment of silence in his honor. And everybody frowns and thinks very serious thoughts. That's not silence at all. I mean real silence, in which we stop thinking and experience reality as reality is. Because after all, if I talk all the time, I can't hear what anyone else has to say. And if I think all the time, and by that I mean specifically talking to yourself subvocally inside your skull, if I think all the time, I have nothing to think about except thoughts. And so I'm never in touch with the real world. Now, what is the real world? Some people have the theory that the real world is material or physical. I say it's made of kind of a stuff. Other people have the theory that the real world is spiritual or mental. But I want you to point out that both those theories of the world are concepts. They are constructions of words. And the real world is not an idea. It is not words. Reality is if you awaken from this illusion, and you understand that black implies white, self implies other, life implies death, or shall I say, death implies life, you can feel yourself not as a stranger in the world, not as something here on probation, not as something that has arrived here by fluke, but you can begin to feel your own existence as absolutely fundamental. I'm not trying to sell you on this idea in the sense of converting you to it. I want you to play with it. I want you to think of its possibilities. I'm not trying to prove it. I'm just putting it forward as a possibility of life to think about. So then, let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream you wanted to dream. And that you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time, or any length of time you wanted to have. And you would naturally, as you began on this adventure of dreams, you would fulfill all your wishes. You would have every kind of pleasure you could conceive. And after several nights of 75 years of total pleasure each, you would say, well, that was pretty great. But now let's have a surprise. Let's have a dream which isn't under control. Well, something is going to happen to me that I don't know what it's going to be. And you would dig that and come out of that and say, wow, that was a close shave, wasn't it? And then you would get more and more adventurous, and you would make further and further out gambles as to what you would dream. And finally, you would dream where you are now. You would dream the dream of living the life that you are actually living today. That would be within the infinite multiplicity of choices you would have, of playing that you weren't God. Because the whole nature of the Godhead, according to this idea, is to play that he's not. So in this idea then, everybody is fundamentally the ultimate reality. Not God in a politically kingly sense, but God in the sense of being the self, the deep down basic whatever there is. And you're all that, only you're pretending you're not.